There's a difference of opinions among the Saudis. You got the older generation who cares about them as a theme,
Hmm.
kind of like the way you care about Baskin Robbins. You know, you'll have other ice cream, but you have a preference. Uh, the other half, especially the younger ones, they just want them gone and they don't really care how. So the Saudis will say some of the right things based on the audience that's in front of them. So, like, for example, when representatives of the African Union were in Riyadh, they said all the right things about anti-imperialism because there's a belief in sub-Saharan Africa that Israel is a colonial project of the West, which is, at best loosely rooted in history, but, that's what they believe. And so Riyadh, trying to expand its diplomatic footprint in Africa, went along with it. But the bottom line is the talks haven't stopped.
Hmm.
And the four countries that had already signed on to the Abraham Accords haven't revoked. Jordan is still a Israeli satellite. Egypt is still de facto an ally and actually hates. Oh yeah,
Stone.
always. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
Egypt was in charge of the Gaza Strip from independence until 67, I believe is the correct year. And they administered it and it was awful and they learned to hate each other deeply and viscerally. It was a far worse occupation under Egypt than it has ever been under Israel. And so when the Israelis are like, the solution here is to move all the Gazans out of Gaza into the Sinai and tent. I was like, oh, the fuck you will. Yeah,
What do you
yeah,
think?
that's not the view in the United States. Let me start with the reality of the situation, then go into why we're talking about abandoning or cutting back aid, because it's really not serious talk. So first, the reality. When the Battle of Kiev happened and that giant convoy of military vehicles advanced on Kiev and then just stopped because they forgot food and fuel, that's when in Washington and in London and in Paris and in Berlin and the rest, we realized we were facing a different sort of conflict than what we thought we were preparing for. We
When was
thought
this? When did this convoy stop?
this was the first week of the war.
Okay. And this was the Russian convoy.
Correct.
Right.
We thought that the war would be over in 1 to 6 months. And that was a reasonable assessment. That was mine as well. And the Russians would eventually then push on the next line of countries, which includes 5 NATO members. And we would have a confrontation between NATO and the Russians on the something close to the old Cold War border, where we would find out exactly what U.S. foreign policy was. Because since roughly mm, since the second W. Bush term, American foreign policy on NATO has been very flimsy. And Trump made it very clear unofficially that if he was reelected for his second term a couple of years back, he was going to pull out of NATO formally on day one. And then you'd have a very different situation with the Europeans unprepared to face down the Russians and having to decide whether they were going to kowtow or what. When the Ukrainians proved that they, who functionally didn't have a military a decade before, could stop the Russians cold and stop what was probably the second largest armed force to march in post-Cold War history, the number one being the U.S. assault on southern Iraq during Desert Storm, that you could have this bunch of guys on four-wheelers basically stop the Russian army. That changed the math because if there's anything we know about the Russians is that for them to feel that they are safe, they have to be able to plug access to their territories. And that means reaching the Danube Delta, and that means reaching the Vistula, which is in downtown Warsaw, and that means eliminating the Baltic states. So that's 5 NATO countries right there in the crosshairs. We know they're coming for them eventually if they can. Yeah.
Like
But
that.
if the
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you had Ukraine fall and a more or less force of equals, then, by Cold War rubric, we understand what happens with a force of equals. There's a lot of posturing, there's a lot of preparation, and there's diplomacy. But if the Russians were having problems taking on Ukraine, which was a basket case, then all of a sudden our assessment of the Russian military is very, very different. And so if they can succeed in Ukraine, what comes up on the Russian border is a mess. Their strategic needs haven't changed. It's their capacity that has.
Right.
And if they know they're not an equal force, they're just going to use nukes.
Mm.
So the decision was made across all of NATO in the first month of the war that we have to prevent the Russians from ever reaching the border, and we have to prevent the Russians from ever facing NATO in a direct confrontation where the nukes would immediately fly. And so every weapon system that the Ukrainians can prove that they can operate and maintain, very big detail there. Germans were very specific on that. Everything that they can operate and maintain, they can have, and everything else is details. Still a lot of details,
Yeah.
but that's where everyone's coming from. What's going on in the United States is that all the serious people who can find Canada on a map and can do basic mathematics understand this and are behind it. So if you go and you talk to the Republican presidential candidates, whether it's Nikki Haley, Chris Christie, Ron DeSantis, they're all more or less on board with that understanding. Okay, it falls into three categories. You've got spare weapons that were decommissioned and were slated for destruction, like 70% of the total. Then you've got
Wow. So
ammo.
spare weapons that were slated for destruction.
Yeah, it's like
Okay.
things we're not using, things that from our point of view are too outdated to transfer to our allies. We were just going to run some cordite around them in an open air pit and blow them up.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Here you go, Ukraine. You can have these.
Okay.
That's what they're fighting with. Okay, so that's category one. That's 70% of the total. Then you've got ammo, maybe 10% of the total. And then the other 20% is some sort of development assistance or budgeting assistance so that the government doesn't shut down. For the Europeans, those ratios are roughly flipped. It's about 70% budget assistance and then 30% military because they don't have much to give.
Just to run the government, just to run things.
Exactly. So from a budgetary point of view, you could make the argument that the Ukrainians are actually saving us money. Probably. That it appears to be the path that we're on now. Each weapon system is different. And as the Ukrainians like to say, they don't have a military, they have a petting zoo of military equipment because everyone has given them their cast-offs and their hand-me-downs, and a lot of it is not interoperable. Yeah. We went through a really, really knockdown, drag-out fight within NATO in the 90s and the early 2000s, not just with the new members from the old Soviet bloc, but our old members, like, guys, none of our stuff works together. And let's be honest, our stuff is better than your stuff. So you need to make some decisions here. Either you modify your stuff so it's interoperable, we have a simpler logistics system, or you buy our stuff. One of the things that came out of that was the Joint Strike Fighter. So a central platform. That means that everyone who chose to go with the upgrade option has a lot of old stuff, and they just gave it all to Ukraine. So eventually, we're all going to run out of hand-me-downs, and we're either going to have to provide the Ukrainians with frontline equipment, or we're going to have to do a massive defense buildup to either overhaul allies with newer stuff and they can give their older stuff, or to do a defense buildup to build the older stuff. And all of those decisions are different based on which country you're in and which equipment you're talking about. But that is very much in play right now.